Building on interface control documents and integration contracts, you now move to the question that decides whether your architecture is truly safe, how an attacker would move through it. Security by design architecture is not a late checklist or a final review. It is the discipline of designing systems so that attacks are harder to execute, easier to detect, and less damaging when they occur. When you adopt security by design, you stop relying on hope and start relying on structure. With the purpose clear, you should treat security by design as part of architecture quality, not as a separate security activity. It means security decisions are embedded in identity, data flows, integrations, trust boundaries, operational monitoring, and recovery design from the start. It also means you can explain security posture as a set of deliberate choices and mapped controls, rather than as vague statements like, "We will secure it later." Now that security by design is defined, you can understand why it must be early. When security is added late, it collides with fixed decisions, delivery deadlines, and limited budgets. Controls become expensive, usability suffers, and risk acceptance becomes informal. You also end up with a weak outcome, where security is patched onto a design that was never built to enforce trust boundaries or minimize attack paths. Security by design prevents this by making security a design constraint, not an afterthought. With timing understood, you now adopt the mindset that makes security architecture effective. Threat-informed design. You do not start with controls, you start with threats. You ask what an attacker would want, how they could get in, where they could move, what they could access, and what would stop them. This mindset makes security real for leaders because you can explain risks as plausible scenarios rather than abstract compliance statements. With threat-informed thinking in place, you can apply threat modeling in a leadership-friendly way. You focus on a small number of realistic attack paths based on your environment, such as compromised identities, exposed interfaces, insecure integrations, data exfiltration, and privilege escalation. You do not need complex models to be effective. You need clear scenarios, clear business impact, and clear mitigation strategies. This keeps the discussion practical and decision-oriented. With threats framed, you now move to one of the most powerful tools in security architecture: trust boundaries. A trust boundary is the line where the level of trust changes. For example, between the public internet and your environment, between a partner network and your internal services, or between a user device and a sensitive data store. If you cannot draw your trust boundaries, you do not truly know where to enforce controls, where to monitor, and where to assume compromise. Trust boundaries make invisible risk visible. With trust boundaries clear, you now apply a mature security principle. Assume breach. Assume breach does not mean you expect failure. It means you design so that if a part of the environment is compromised, the attacker cannot easily move laterally, escalate privileges, or access sensitive data. You treat identity, network boundaries, service-to-service access, and data access as layers of containment. This is how you design for resilience against real attacks rather than perfect conditions. With assume breach established, you now place identity at the center of security by design. Most modern attacks succeed through identity compromise, privilege escalation, or misuse of legitimate access. You design identity controls that enforce strong authentication, least privilege, and clear separation of duties. You also design privilege access as a controlled capability with monitoring and accountability, because privilege access is where high impact risk concentrates. With identity placed correctly, you now anchor security in data protection. You identify sensitive and critical data, define how it is classified, define who can access it, and define how it is protected in transit and at rest. You also design to reduce data exposure, meaning you minimize where sensitive data travels, reduce unnecessary copies, and control how data is shared across integrations. This is how you reduce both breach impact and compliance risk. With data protection clear, you now focus on integration and application programming interface design as a major attack surface. You ensure interfaces enforce authentication and authorization, validate inputs, limit exposure, and handle errors safely. You also ensure interfaces have rate controls and monitoring so abnormal behavior is detected early. This is where security by design aligns directly with your interface control documents, turning contracts into enforceable security boundaries. With boundaries secured, you now design for visibility because security without visibility is guesswork. You define what must be logged, what must be monitored, what signals indicate suspicious activity, and how detection will be triaged. You also ensure logs support investigation by capturing context, not just events. When you design visibility upfront, incident response becomes faster, audit readiness improves, and security posture becomes measurable. With visibility designed, you now convert security thinking into something leaders and auditors can trust. Control mapping. Control mapping is the practice of connecting threats and risks to specific security controls and showing where those controls are implemented in the architecture. This makes security defensible because you can show that controls are not random, they exist to mitigate defined risks. It also supports governance because you can assess whether required controls are present, consistent, and effective. With control mapping established, you now handle the most important reality in enterprise security: trade-offs. Security, cost, usability, and speed always compete. Your role is to make trade-offs explicit and defensible. If a control adds friction, you explain why it is necessary and what risk it mitigates. If a control cannot be implemented immediately, you document compensating controls and residual risk acceptance. This prevents informal security debt from becoming permanent risk. With trade-offs visible, you now ensure security by design is sustained through governance and assurance. Security requirements must be reviewed early, exceptions must be managed transparently, and security readiness must be validated before go live. You also ensure ownership is clear after deployment, because security posture decays when no one is responsible for maintaining controls and monitoring signals. This is how security by design remains real across the full life cycle. With the full approach defined, you can now ground it in a realistic example. Imagine you are designing a digital customer services platform that integrates with billing, identity, and customer communications. The platform handles sensitive customer data and must remain available during peak usage. You begin by mapping trust boundaries, such as the boundary between the public internet and the platform, the boundary between the platform and internal systems, and the boundary around sensitive data stores. You identify threats such as credential theft, injection attacks through interfaces, privilege misuse, and data exfiltration through integrations. You then map controls to these threats, including strong identity controls, least privilege access, data protection, secure interface validation, and monitoring signals for abnormal behavior. You also design response readiness, ensuring you can detect, investigate, and contain incidents quickly. And you document trade-offs where legacy constraints require temporary exceptions with compensating controls. As you close the lecture, you should recognize the patterns that cause security architecture to fail even when intentions are good. Security by design fails when threat thinking is ignored, when trust boundaries are unclear, when identity and privilege access are treated as implementation details, and when control mapping is missing. It also fails when monitoring is treated as optional, when exceptions are informal, and when ownership after go live is unclear. You avoid these failures by designing security as structure, mapping controls to threats, and governing security as part of architecture assurance. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can apply security by design architecture in a practical, leadership ready way. Security by design architecture embeds security decisions into the architecture from the start, making attacks harder, detection faster, and impact smaller. Threat-informed design starts with realistic attack paths and business impact, then drives design decisions and control choices. Trust boundaries are essential because they show where trust changes and where controls must be enforced to contain attack movement. Identity and privilege access are central because identity is the control plane of modern systems and the most common path attackers exploit. Data protection and secure integration design reduce exposure and prevent interfaces from becoming the weakest link. Control mapping turns security intent into defensible evidence by linking risks to specific controls implemented in the architecture. Governance and assurance keep security by design real by managing exceptions, validating readiness, and maintaining ownership through sustainment. As you move into the next lecture, start looking at every architecture through one question. How would an attacker move through this design, and what would stop them? Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos in this playlist, like this video, so it reaches more leaders and architects who want practical security by design guidance without heavy jargon. Comment with the biggest security by design challenge you face, whether it is unclear trust boundaries, identity complexity, integration risk, or control mapping expectations. Share this video with someone working on architecture governance or security architecture, because threat-informed design and control mapping are the difference between security by intention and security by design.